Hey everyone, my name's Justin Anderson, and this is the first video for Science in the Bible. So if you saw the little video that came before this, kind of the intro, gave a brief introduction to what we were going to be doing during these videos, but just to go over it a little bit more, since this is the first video, this is the first one we're going to be doing. These videos are really going to be focused on showing how God works in science and how science came to be through God or through a creator. So it's going to be really cool because you're going to be equipped with essentially information that you could go out and reach people that are centered in science and have the mindset of science is all knowing and all being and there can't be a God because of science. You can now say, well, this is why there has to be a God, and it's backed by the science that we have. So it's going to be really cool to give you ammunition for that. If you don't have any interest in doing that, if you're not the kind of person that likes to go out and do that stuff, it's just going to give you more information for your own knowledge. Knowing you'll be able to figure out how things work, why things work from a biblical and a scientific perspective. Now, I think the key thing in there is we're going to be looking at how science is backed by God. How without God, science does not work. So there's a lot of examples in science where we don't know the answer. If we just look at it purely from a secular scientific view, the answer is unknown. There's no way of explaining how life began. We've been trying to do that for decades and decades. There's no only scientific way to prove that. The only 100% way that anyone has ever been able to come up with is there is a creator. We'll look at questions such as, why did the universe begin and how did it begin? Well, scientifically there's so many differing viewpoints that none of them come together and actually make up one full scenario. Now we have the Big Bang, we have an expanding universe, we have all those theories, but a theory is not law or not fact. However, we have Genesis that if you're a Christian and you believe the Bible, it is law and it is fact that God spoke the universe and the world into being. So we'll look at things like that. We'll look at how God backs the science. We'll also look at some pretty controversial things. So we'll look at things such as evolution. Could we have evolved from single-celled organisms or from apes or from fish? We'll look at things such as the genetics that go into race and changing over time with evolution. What does that look like? Can you as a Christian believe in evolution, or is that something that if you believe in it, it's not a biblical standpoint? So we'll look at biblically where all that comes from and what that looks like. And I will just say right here, from my knowledge, from looking at science, reading the Bible, I do not believe that we came from single-celled organisms or that the earth is billions of years old. So, while I say that, it might sound biased, but we're going to look at it purely from a scientific viewpoint that is then backed by scripture and by biblical standings. So the really cool thing is that we're going to be saying, I'm going to be presenting these scientific findings that you'll see the things that are backed by scripture seem to have a lot more base and meatiness to them. They have more explanations, they have more reasonings behind them, and the things that aren't based by the scripture, that aren't from God, kind of seem to fall apart when you look at them closer. So we're really going to look at how God has to be the basis for science to work, that science without God usually does not provide results or answers. Some other controversial things that we might look at are gender. We might look at how many genders are there really? 2 or 37. We'll look at things such as global warming. Could God have created an earth that we could destroy and that we could kill? So we'll look at all those controversial things. Pretty much if there's a controversial thing you can think of and I haven't mentioned it, go ahead and drop it in the comments below. If there's something that you want to learn about in science, that how does that tie back to God, put it in the comments and there can definitely be a mini series on it. So that's a quick overview. That's just a quick rundown of what's going to happen. There's so much in here that I can't go into more without actually going into the topics. So what I'm going to do is just start going into one of the topics we're going to cover, which is human life. More specifically, we're going to be tackling at its root the argument of abortion, when human life begins, what is human life actually scientifically and biblically. What is this whole thing? Why is there an argument about abortion between science and God when in reality we all agree when human life begins? So why is there an argument? So that's going to be our first topic, and we're going to look at it through the characteristics of life. So there are certain characteristics that all living things have to be classified as living. And when these characteristics begin is when life begins. So once that first characteristic is present, that organism is alive because at some point it's going to have all the other characteristics throughout its life. So what this ultimately boils down to is, when do our lives begin? And that's what we're going to be looking through throughout these next series. So it absolutely amazes me to this day that science refuses to acknowledge that everything must have been created. Simply because of the first thing we're going to talk about. For years they have been trying to play God, so God with a lowercase g, because they're trying to create life from nothing. And for years we have failed. We seem to refuse that life could have been given to us from a Father that loves us. It's like there's an explanation, there's a reason, but we refuse to believe it because it can't be true. It's too crazy to be true. Yet there's no tangible evidence for God not being true. There's no proof that God can't be true, that God isn't real. We cannot create life without God. God is the only being that can create life from nothing. We've tried, as humans, we have tried, and it has not worked. We cannot create life spontaneously out of thin air. God can, though. So, I say that to say, maybe that is why, when I say that, I say the inability to accept that we had to be created because we can't create life. Maybe that is why we are so incapable as a society of humans to realize that unborn life is life. Because we just simply some of us are unable to understand where life comes from. So that's where we start to get into the argument of when did it begin, or when does it begin? And even more incomprehensible is that science does actually give us a definition of when life begins. Now, I say that and you're all probably thinking, great, a scientific definition of when life begins. But Princeton University has a great collection of references titled Life Begins at Fertilization. So if you want to go and look at some of these references, there's dozens of them. Princeton University, Life Begins at Fertilization, which also means conception. Life begins at conception. When the sperm and the egg meet, life begins. Now, I'm going to read a few of them for you, and I think it's going to sound a little shocking when you hear what some of these scientists and some of these journals say about when human life begins. So here's the first one from Keith Moore. It was published in Essentials of Human Embryology. So human development begins after the union of male and female gametes, or germ cells, during a process known as fertilization, quote in parentheses conception. Fertilization is a sequence of events that begins with the contact of a sperm with a secondary oocyte and ends with the fusion of their pronuclei. So what this is essentially saying is fertilization is a sequence that takes the sperm and the egg, and when they come together and their half nucleus bind into one nucleus to form a full nucleus, life has begun. And it says, and the mingling of their chromosomes to form a new cell. So we have a cell now. This fertilized ovum, known as a zygote, is a large diploid cell that is the beginning or primordium of a human being. So right there we're saying this cell is the beginning of a human being. It's called a fetus, called an embryo, but it is the beginning of a human being. This is when human being begins. This is when the life begins, when that fertilization occurs. So that was from Keith Moore. Now, Ida Docks in the HarperCollins Illustrated Medical Dictionary has this: embryo, an organism in the earliest stage of development in a man from the time of conception to the end of the second month in the uterus. So she's defining when an embryo is. Now, a lot of people are going to read that and say, into the second trimester or into the second month. Sorry, not trimester, because trimesters are longer than 1 month. At the end of the second month is when that embryo no longer is an embryo and becomes a fetus. So some people take this to think, well, that's when it becomes a person. But we must remember that this embryo is the beginning of life. This embryo is a living thing. Now, is it viable outside the mother at this point to grow on its own? Well, no, but it is alive. This is a living thing. If you were to kill a woman at this point that had a baby, which we at this point would call an embryo inside of her, you'd be considered killing both things. Now, a third one, again from Ida Docks. So this is, I put that twice. So we're going to go on to Jan Langman. I just was going to read the second one. Jan Langman in Medical Embryology, 3rd edition. So the development of a human being begins with fertilization, a process by which two highly specialized cells, so that's the sperm and the egg, unite to give rise to a new organism, the zygote. So we are saying here the sperm and the egg, as soon as they meet, they create a new organism. That organism is us. They are giving rise to the new organism. It begins as soon as those two meet. And then here is the last one I have. Now, this one is really cool. Douglas Considine. This is Van Nostrand's Scientific Encyclopedia. So something really cool here. The quote, embryo, the developing individual between the union of the germ cells. Germ cells are the sperm and the egg. And the completion of the organs which characterize its body when it becomes a separate organism. So right now he's saying the developing individual between the union of the germ cells and the completion of the organs which characterize its body when it becomes a separate organism. So that's what he's saying is the definition of an embryo. He's saying from fertilization until the organs are characterized. And that's where we also get, the heartbeat bills, the heartbeat laws and all that. Once you can hear the heartbeat, once the organs are created, once they are formed, that's when it becomes a person, because we're saying that's the end of the embryo stage. But that embryo is still alive. It still has the first character of life at this point before it even becomes a fetus. At the moment the sperm cell of the human male meets the ovum of the female and the union results in a fertilized zygote, a new life has begun. So he begins with the definition of embryo, saying that it doesn't become a separate organism until the organs are complete. But he also says at the moment of fertilization, a new life has begun. Now he even goes further than saying a new organism. He says new life. He is saying this is when life begins. The term embryo covers the several stages of early development from conception to the 9th or 10th week of life. So this is a little bit different. And this is also something cool to look at. We've had 2 months as the embryo. We've had 9 to 10 months as the embryo. We've had 9th or 10th week of life. So we've had different stages of saying when the embryo changes from an embryo to a fetus. Personally, they're all children. They're all babies. They are all living humans. They are human beings inside of us. Now, they might not look like a human in the beginning, but they have the first characteristic of life that makes us humans, that makes us living. So what can we take away from all of these quotes? I read you a few, and I know we talked about them in the beginning, but what is the whole point of giving you those references? Well, if you go back and look, and if you choose to look at Princeton's University on there and look at those references, every single one states that life begins at fertilization. Every one says that is when human life begins. Now, I want to make perfectly clear here, we haven't even dove in to the God side of this. We're still on the science side of this right now. And we are already saying from medical journals, from research, that life begins at fertilization. Science tells us that. So if you ever are in an argument with someone about abortion or, well, they aren't a human yet, they aren't this yet, they aren't that yet. Well, science tells us life begins at conception. So to say that aborting a fetus isn't murdering a human life, well, that's just wrong because the life has already begun. The life begins before we even get to the womb. We'll go over that a little bit later, but life begins at the moment of conception. Science backs that. Science tells us that is true. So for us to go in and take a baby out of a mother, that is ending a life. It is taking something that is living and causing it to cease to live, which is murder. It is killing a human. So why is that so important? We just said it. It proves without a shadow of the doubt, without even going into the God side, that anytime after conception you're killing things. So if you know someone that is kind of struggling, or not really struggling, they're so hammered into the scientific. They're like, if it's not science, I'm not believing it. If you even talk about God, I'm just going to shut you out. Well, I just gave you like 12 minutes of why scientifically you can prove to that person that life begins at conception, why you can have backed by science references that say life begins at fertilization. And that might open a door for you to then go into the next thing where we're looking at, where does God come into this? How does God play the role? And the really cool thing is you're going to see how God is going to build up what we just learned about. God is going to back the science. Now, remember when I said at the beginning, if it's not God backed, it's not God breathed, and it'll fall apart. It'll crumble, and it won't have any standing. This that we just said, life begins at fertilization, at conception, is God backed. That's how we know we can trust it and hold on to it and use it as ammunition to bring people over from one side to the other, and we can bring people to see a new light. So, I say all this to say the very first characteristic of life that we're going to look at is cells. Cells are a characteristic of life, and once the embryo is formed, we are cells and life begins. This is the first characteristic of life that is present for us. We are a single-celled organism at this point, and our life has now begun because we have now displayed the first characteristic of life. We'll do all the others later, and we will talk about all those characteristics of life as well. But as of right now, we have the first characteristic of life at that moment we are living. As I said, though, we are unicellular, so this is one cell. Only one, very, very tiny. You have millions and billions and trillions of them in your body, but we started from one. Now, science also says everything started from one cell. And they said, well, everything started from one cell and everything still starts from one cell. The amazing thing is that within 24 hours, we are now 2 cells, and then we're 4, and then we're 8, and then we're 16, and we start to multiply and replicate before we're even in the womb. And God gave us such amazing things that are made with one cell to prove that a living thing can just be one cell. That even if it is one cell, it can be considered living. So even when we are a one-celled embryo or zygote in our mother's fallopian tubes, we are living beings, even at that stage. And God gave us these few creatures to tell us, these few organisms to tell us that that is true, and you will recognize a few of these. A single-celled organism, E. coli. A single-celled organism, Streptococcus, so strep. A single-celled organism, amoebas. Has anyone ever seen Amoeba Jones, that old video? Well, amoebas are a single-celled organism. Actually, all bacteria are single-celled organisms. So if you have bacteria, it's a single cell. Now, E. coli and strep, those are some harmful bacteria for the most part. But we also have that living inside of us pretty much every day. Bacteria, we might sound harmful, but God created these single-celled organisms in order to help us. And he created these organisms to show us that unicellular life is possible. And not only is it possible, it is important for us to survive. We start as a single cell. We need single-celled organisms to survive. Inside of your bodies right now, you have trillions of bacteria. So trillions of organisms that only have one cell. Now, we actually have more bacteria in our bodies than we do cells. So looking at this, we're actually made more of bacteria than we are cells. It's like a 10-to-1 ratio according to the Human Microbiome Project. So for every cell, you have about 10 bacteria according to that project. And these do so many things. They make it where you can digest in your stomach. They actually help you get not sick by having a well-balanced bacteria microbiome inside of you. So these organisms that are made of one cell make it so that we can live. And they are living. So God showed us that life begins with one-celled organisms. God has given us organisms that thrive from one cell to show us that as soon as we become one cell, we are alive. This is an amazing way of God working through that to show us as soon as you're one cell, you're living. You don't need more than that one cell to become alive. So, again, the first characteristic of life, cellular organization. Once we become that single cell, we are living. So once the sperm and the egg meet, come together, form that zygote, we are alive. And now we've looked at how God has given us other things to look at for that. He's given us other organisms that can show this, that can back this, that can breathe life into this because of his goodness and his greatness. But let's take an even closer look. So, an even closer look into that is the embryo is more precisely called a zygote, and it's a single cell. So you're like, yeah, we've talked about that. We've said that already. But we can call this life, and we can call it life because of what God has showed us with the bacteria and the single cellular organisms. But we can also call this life, and it can be backed with a Bible verse that you all have heard of before. Now, this Bible verse is talking about our spiritual life. But when we actually know how we physically go from the ovaries into our mother's womb, this is also amazing because God has given us a little hint of before we're even in our mother's wombs, we're alive. So Jeremiah 1:5, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. So, this is telling us that he knew Jeremiah before he was even born. He knows us before we are born, before he forms us in the womb. Now, of course, he's talking about our spiritual selves. But something amazing, something so cool that happens in a woman's body is that before we reach the womb, we are being formed in our mother's fallopian tubes. So we aren't actually started in our mother's wombs, in the uterus. That is not where our life begins. Our life begins in her fallopian tubes. Before you are in the womb, you are being formed and you are growing. So it's so cool. Of course, this verse is talking about our spiritual, about our spirits. God knew us. God placed us in our mothers and caused us to grow. But it is also telling us, and it is also lining up with how the embryo travels once it's fertilized. Fertilization does not occur in the womb and in the uterus. It occurs in the fallopian tubes before that embryo is in the uterus. So it's super cool. Like I said, this, of course, we know this scripture all the time. But it gives us a little insight, too, on how reproduction is happening. And it lines up with scientifically what we have proven, that life begins before you're in the uterus. You travel down this fallopian tube, and then you attach to your mother's uterus. You attach in the womb, and you are actually growing as you travel down. You're going from that 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 cells. You're already starting to grow. So yes, of course, Jeremiah 1:5 is talking about before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. It's meaning God placed us there. We know that. But it's also backing up what we see, that we are being formed before we are in the womb. And it's giving life and breath, saying, hey, Once you find this out, it's going to make even more sense. Like, you're alive before you're even in the uterus. You are alive. We are living. Before we were even placed in the womb, we are living. And it is so cool to see that. It's so cool to see how life begins before we even are in our mother's womb. Both our spiritual and our physical lives begin before we're even in our mother's womb. And that is backed biblically and scientifically. It's backed both places. Both of those places show us that life begins before we even attach to our mothers. As we're just floating inside of her as an embryo, we are living. We are life. So, thank you for listening. I'm super excited to do more of these. The next week, we're going to be looking at more characteristics of life. Just more reasons as to why, science gives us these characteristics of life, and God in the Bible shows us these characteristics of life. So it's really excited. I'm really pumped to talk more about it, and I'm excited to just speak out on this particular topic for those that are unborn, for those that have a mass genocide going against them, and for unneeded deaths in our world of the babies that never get to have a voice. God bless you all, and have a good day.